Okay.
All right. So good evening and welcome everyone to this week's Georgetown Federalist Society event. We have what should be an interesting event planned for you all. And I guess I'll hand it over to Michael at first to do the introductions.
Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for being here. Tonight's event is Carbon and Conservationism, the government's role in combating climate change. Our two speakers tonight are Professor Jonathan Adler and Professor William Busby. Professor Jonathan Adler is a professor of law and director of the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law at Case Western University. Professor Adler is the author of and editor of 7 books, including Business in the Roberts Court and Rebuilding the Ark, New Perspectives on Endangered Species Act Reform. He is also a regular legal commentator on constitutional and regulatory issues, appearing on numerous radio and television programs ranging from the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and NPR's Talk of the Nation to the Fox News Channel and Entertainment Tonight. He has frequently testified before Congress, and his work has been cited in the US Supreme Court. Professor Adler received his BA magna cum laude from Yale University and his JD summa cum laude from the George Mason University School of Law. Our second speaker, Professor William Busby, holds the inaugural Edward and Carol Walter Professor Chair and is a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. He also serves as the faculty director of Georgetown Law's Environmental Law and Policy Program. Professor Busby is the author of books such as Fighting Westway, Environmental Law, Citizen Activism, and the Regulatory War that Transformed New York City, and he has been a co-author of the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th editions of Environmental Protection, Law, and Policy. He regularly assists with appellate and Supreme Court environmental, federalism, and regulatory litigation, and has also testified before congressional committees on environmental and regulatory matters. Professor Busby received his BA from Amherst College and his JD from Columbia University. And finally, our moderator tonight is our very own Justin Drewer, who is a junior in the college, majoring in government and minoring in economics and history. He is one of the editors-in-chief of the Georgetown Review, a student publication focused on framing campus issues in a multi-partisan light. And he received the Edward B. Bunn Award for Journalistic Excellence for a piece about the Georgetown bureaucracy. He is also the vice president of Georgetown University's Federalist Society chapter and a current intern at the Federalist Society working on the Freedom of Thought project. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
All right, thank you, Michael, for those introductions and kicking us off here. I'd like to remind the audience that at any time during this event, you can put questions that you have in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them towards the end of the event and the questioning period. You can choose to send them anonymously or not, though if you send them with your identifying information, I think we have a best questions award at the end of the semester, and you get something for that. I think we're still doing that. So there's some incentive to keep it not anonymous. So with that, I'd also like to remind that the views expressed in this event don't represent the Federalist Society in general or any of its members, purely personal opinion. So with that in mind, I will kick us off with the first question, and whichever of you, Professor Busby or Adler, want to answer this first, feel free. So we'll start with, should the United States implement a national tax on carbon emissions?
I think we should let our guest, since I'm a Georgetown member, we should be good hosts and let Jonathan go first. So I'll let Jonathan take the first, and he's also, I think, a card-carrying member of the Federalist Society, and so
I am.
So doubly, you should let him go first, and I'll wriggle.
First, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a shame to not be able to do this in person, but I'm always happy to do these events and fun to be able to talk with students. And obviously not as much fun over Zoom. We can't go out for drinks or whatever afterwards, but I'll have a drink afterwards. All of you can have a drink afterwards. Those of you that are old enough to go out and have drinks. So should the US adopt a carbon tax? I think the answer is yes. And let me say a little bit about why. And I'm gonna try to cover a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. I'm also going to simplify some things for the purposes of just conceptually why someone who is fairly right of center, who has been, who considers himself to be a classical liberal or Whig or libertarian or fusionist or libertarian conservative or what have you, would so readily and eagerly say that a carbon tax is a good idea. First is that climate change is a problem. Humanity has been increasing the global atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. That increases the greenhouse forcing within the atmosphere. I'm going to radically oversimplify the science just for purposes of our discussion, but basically that not only warms the atmosphere, but it also creates the potential for certain sorts of climatic changes within the atmosphere that are broader or more severe or extreme than would occur without that greenhouse forcing. So for example, warming, insofar as it leads to warming of the oceans, increases the upper bound potential of hurricane strength than would have existed absent that warming. It affects the distribution and timing of rainfall, which has broad effects in terms of when water is available in various ecological systems, which matter not just for environmental systems, but also matter for people, has effects on drought patterns, has effects on agricultural growth and agricultural production and so on. So greenhouse warming is not simply about, oh, the average temperature of the Earth will increase by some amount distributed over the globe over a certain time period. It also has other effects which are more acute and potentially more severe. And so there are two ways that I think it's worth thinking about the fact that we are doing this. One is, if we want to take the standpoint of a very kind of hardcore, almost Rothbardian view of liberty and property rights, we know that while we don't know with certainty what the precise impacts of climate change will be, we know that even the most modest estimates about what climate change is likely to produce are extremely likely to produce outcomes which do have effects that we would normally recognize as the sorts of rights violations that justify governmental action. So for example, if you go to law school in torts class, you'll probably read cases where one landowner does something on his land that alters the way in which water flows to cause flooding on the neighbor's land. And that is recognized as a tort. It can often even be a trespass, which is a particularly severe sort of invasion on somebody else's property. And it's actionable. And so whether or not we have the sort of governmental structures that would allow for adjudicating these sort of disputes, we know that harms, if they are not already occurring, will almost certainly occur of the sort that generally justify governmental intervention. That's one way that I think is useful to think about climate change. A second way that's useful to think about climate change is this. Is say, as we increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are creating a range of scenarios, a range of possibilities. And some of those may be somewhat minor and things that we could adjust to and adapt to, but some of them are not so minor. And the not so minor, the more extreme scenarios are extreme enough that even if we think the likelihood of those extreme scenarios is really small, again, we would normally see that sort of risk justifies governmental action to solve the collective action problem that would otherwise exist. It's much like traditional conservative arguments for national security spending, right? When I was in college, the Soviet Union was still around. We didn't know if the Soviet Union was going to try and invade one of our allies. We didn't know how aggressive they would or would not be in terms of trying to spread global communism. But we knew that the risk was real. And we knew that if the Soviet Union was as aggressive as we thought it might be, some of the consequences to human liberty and to our way of life could be quite severe. And so that justified expenditures and investments to prevent not just the median estimate of what bad things could happen, or the most likely estimate of what the worst things are could happen, but or what was likely to happen, but what were some of the worst case scenarios? So for example, our national defense strategy was generally premised on the ability to deploy forces in two dispersed theaters simultaneously. And again, low likelihood that would be necessary, but the consequences of not being able to respond to that sort of threat are great enough that it justifies investment. And I think climate change is like that. There's some economists that talk about this as the fat tail problem, that at the extreme distribution, the negative consequences are so large that you can't just look at them and say, we'll do nothing, right? They justify prudent actions that can reduce the likelihood of that risk coming to pass, of those eventualities occurring. So I think both of those frameworks are about thinking about when governmental action is justified, are ones that I think are folks on the right, folks in FedSoc circles should understand how to think about problems that way. And I think climate change fits those. Now, why a carbon tax? And I'll be a little more quick here. I think that in general, what we want to be able to do is power modern civilization in a way that minimizes the risks of these potential consequences. And that requires dramatic innovation and deployment of technologies, some of which we have, many of which, perhaps most of which we don't quite have, that will enable us to have the benefits of modern civilization in a low carbon way. And the most effective way we know to both spur people to innovate and to deploy things is to magnify the economic incentives for them to do so, to ensure that there are marginal incentives, that there are always incentives on the margin to try and reduce one's carbon consumption. And a carbon tax is a way of doing that more comprehensively, more broadly than any other mechanism. It further leaves open all the various possible ways of innovation that traditional regulatory tools and other mechanisms can't accomplish. There are other things I think we can do on top of a carbon tax to help accelerate innovation and deployment, but I think a carbon tax is and should be the central component of our climate strategy. The last thing I'll say about the carbon tax in terms of this current political moment, the general claim is, and one that I accept, is that it would be better to start driving down emissions now, insofar as we can. That we don't want to be talking about what we're going to do 10 years from now, 20 years from now. The reality is if the Biden administration decides it's going to start first undoing the Trump administration environmental regulations and then adopting new ones, and maybe Congress eventually in 2 or 3 years passes a statute that then gives EPA lots of new regulatory authority to adopt lots of new regulations, if we're lucky, we might see regulations covering some significant portions of the US economy 5 years from now, if they survive in court. It took the EPA more than that amount of time to set up the first stage of the acid rain trading program, which only covered a few hundred facilities. And carbon is produced ubiquitously. So just in terms of getting things done quickly, getting incentives in place quickly, a carbon tax can be could be up and running within a year, easy. British Columbia did it in about 4.5, 5 months economy-wide. The other sorts of strategies we know of adopting are ones that cannot be adopted that quickly. They're also ones that entail legal risk in the sense that depending on how they're adopted and implemented, they could face court challenge. The Environmental Protection Agency has never been good about meeting statutory deadlines. It has never been good about regulating quickly. It missed most of its deadlines and continues to miss most of its deadlines under the Clean Air Act, giving it a new set of deadlines to regulate carbon. Not only would be bad for liberty for all sorts of traditional reasons of the sorts of excuses it would give federal regulators to second guess, question, and control what are ultimately should be private business decisions, but it also won't achieve the sorts of results on climate change that we generally say we want. So for all those reasons, I think a carbon tax is a great idea. And I added some of that stuff at the end because I wanted to make sure I said at least a few things that I think Bill will disagree with.
So Jonathan, thank you. And Justin, thank you. And Michael, thank you also for inviting us. And then welcome to all the students who are here. Go Georgetown. And for all of you who are finding this to be a hard semester, I hope we soon have a return to more ordinary, robust interactions in person and that we can do so safely. So as is often the case when Jonathan and I have been supposedly opposing witnesses at hearings and conferences and the like, I agree with much of what he said. And indeed, he said a lot. I would never have gone to the Soviet Union, but it's always good to bring in some of these other references just to keep the audience alert. So let me just say a couple things. So fundamentally, the first part of what Jonathan said, I think, is perhaps among the most important takeaway points, which is, the science is robust. It is overwhelming, peer-reviewed science. Our Department of Defense, you look at almost any of those who don't have an axe to grind, climate change is real. The anthropogenic, that is human-caused portion of it, is substantial, and the risks are massive. And I have former students who are now top environmental, essentially adaptation planners for different branches of the military, and they talk to me about what they're doing. These are very serious policy challenges that will disrupt a lot, and probably will already disrupt a lot, but could get far worse if we don't take action. So I think that is a critically important point, and I know that people affiliated with the Federalist Society, that some people have been climate skeptics, or they'll say, oh, climate is real, but it's not human. But the reality is climate change is happening, and there is the need to act. Also, I think I agree also with one of Jonathan's big points, which is, the law does not work well when it acts just after the fact, when the disaster has happened, especially in the environmental realm where there are resources we all rely on. Law, to be effective, needs to be precautionary, and it needs to take action at the point where it is effective, but also, as he said correctly, when it's efficient to do so, when you can do so without being hugely wasteful in the expenses spent to address a problem. So I think that is all absolutely sound and critically important. And then similarly, this climate change is a problem that is much like the basic rationales for why the government intervenes. There are certain areas where without government intervention, it's hard to see other private arrangements and incentives without government creating the right signals. So therefore, Jonathan and I have agreed now more than we've ever agreed. No, actually, that's what we've often agreed. So then the question was very particular. So then what do you do about this? And the question was, should we enact a carbon tax? And the basic answer Jonathan gave is yes. And I agree. And then the only thing I would say is that, but that should not be read to say, and that is it. Okay. So for you all being undergrads, and I asked the organizers what your backgrounds are, but I know many of you are interested in policy or politics or law, but there's a whole body of law which thinks about problems and thinks about the regulatory tools. That is, if you have a problem, what's the best way to address a problem? And different problems are addressed better or worse depending on regulatory tools. So a tax on carbon is trying to send a signal in the market. So those who produce carbon are basically paying for it. And then as a correlative or concomitant matter, that those who are producing the same good, often energy or their products, in a lower carbon way are rewarded in the market. And so it sends a very important constructive signal without telling people exactly what to do. And so when Jonathan said at the end that it avoids some of the problems of regulation, I think what he was alluding to is regulation sometimes can be too constrictive. It can tie the hands of people and tell them how to do things instead of trying to get them to do things that avoid harms or move things in the good direction. And I'll give an example. So I won't go as far as how do I say, as erudite as Jonathan's connections here, but I will say this. I was at a session right before COVID hit where people were talking about energy markets. And there were a bunch of people who were different players in energy markets. And one of them, actually several people, were talking about exciting developments in cleaner energy forms, some working in making products and using energy, others devising business models, and others coming up with technological innovations. And again, people said, it's amazing the things that are happening. It's amazing how the cost of clean energy has come down. it's amazing the products we have. We think you've figured out the scale to use solar with batteries, and there people were talking about it. And then there inevitably was a pause, and they said, but these are very challenging times because we have these great products, but we're not being rewarded in the market because the dirtier forms of energy that right now are cleaner because they're not being charged for what are called externalities. That is, people are producing goods but causing harms, and they're not paying for those harms. What these business people said is, without that additional market signal, which would usually be imposed by law, they were losing in the market. Like some were making a go of it, but they were all struggling instead of winning big time. So a tax is clearly a good signal. And the reason I want to just make clear is that doesn't mean it's the only tool, okay? And so the organizers have given us some other questions. So you have to think about who would be doing what. And so we're going to turn to some questions about who the regulator would be. And so for many reasons, but a lot having to do with federalism and respect for state and local differences and choosing at the micro scale how people want to live, you also want to allow people to make additional choices about the environment they live in. You know, I grew up, I was born in New York City, and some people want to live in New York City. I think it's a great place, right? But other people want to live out in the Pacific Northwest, an area with pine trees and fresh air. And so, you know, you want to give people that choice. So you want to leave room for other regulatory choices. And then the last thing I'll say about that is the one problem with a tax that you all should be aware of. If you send just a price signal, there is a problem with what's called hotspots, okay? And that is, if people are just being essentially taxed in producing a risk, it will discourage it, but you still can have this possibility that there will be concentrations of risky areas where other levels of regulation may want to come in and protect people more. And so I think the view of most is taxes are an essential part of the tool set. It's been shown to be effective, but you don't want to preclude other tools, especially by other layers of regulation. So I'll stop there. I know where some of the other questions are going. Let me see, I actually had one other thing. One other point, just since a number of you, I know at least Justin among them, doing some economics. Another thing just to think about when you're thinking about any law and policy is, if you want a signal to be sent to the market to correct harmful behavior, you also need to think about whether that signal will be stable, okay? That there's a real problem if law is changing all the time. If you want to send a signal where people will make choices and invest and feel and make life choices where they aren't going to be suddenly upset, you want basically good law or good practices to be entrenched and rewarded. And so one of the risks of taxes versus some other tools is taxes tend to send a signal that can disappear overnight, okay? And so it's not clear to me that taxes are, unless combined with some other rewards, I think there's this risk that say, carbon tax would be subject to rapid vacillations. There'd be a tax, then you suddenly have, President Hawley would come in or someone would come in and suddenly say no carbon tax, and all those businesses would go under. Then someone else would come in and they would say yes, carbon tax. And so you do want to think about regulatory strategies and tools that will essentially reward and also somewhat entrench good behavior to create stability in markets.
All right, thank you for that conversation about taxes. Along a similar line, the next question is climate change policy, which we've defined as policy that is intended to prevent climate change or the effects of climate change, best left to federal, local, or state government?
Jonathan, do you want to go first? Or me to go
I'm
first?
happy to. So I'll say a couple things. So first, just really quickly, and we can get into both of these more later if folks want to. I'm not worried about hotspots with carbon, because for carbon, we care about it being dispersed in the global atmosphere. Hotspots, I think, are relevant for other sorts of pollutants, but for which I probably would not support a tax. but for carbon I do, and in part because it's dispersed. We don't really care where it's coming from. What matters, it's in the atmosphere. It has that greenhouse warming potential. Whereas other pollutants, some of which come from some of the same sources, we may care about hotspots. A tax enacted by legislation is going to be more stable and consistent than things done through the administrative process, and a lot more stable and consistent than trying to do cap and trade, which, unless it is modified, tends to produce extreme price volatility. Totally agree, stability is important. I think taxes are better than the alternatives on those grounds. In terms of what level of government, in theory, because we're talking about the global atmosphere, we might say, well, we might want things to be done internationally. The problem is that we don't have international institutions that are sufficiently competent or capable enough of dealing with something like that. And we might actually be afraid of international institutions that were sufficiently competent to control or regulate the most ubiquitous byproduct of industrial civilization. So that's not on the table. I think the federal government is really where most of the action should be in terms of focusing on mitigation, that is reducing emissions. Carbon tax should be adopted at the federal level with border adjustments to deal with the trade implications. I think there are other things the federal government can do at scale that it would be silly for state and local governments to try and do. So, for example, I've written about the use of technology inducement prizes and other strategies that are designed to fill in some of the gaps in the incentives that innovators face for developing low carbon technologies. Basically, the patent system is really good at providing innovators with super competitive rewards for innovating, for coming up with new things. But that only works if their innovation is capable of internalizing the benefits of that innovation. So if a widget that reduces your labor inputs or your energy inputs or whatever, well, those are costs to production. If I have a temporary monopoly for selling that widget because I invented it, I can capture the gains that the people that purchase my widget get. I can capture that with the patent. If the gains are reduced emissions to a global commons, well, that's not priced. Those aren't costs that my potential customers are bearing, so I can't capture those gains. And so the patent system actually does not provide the same incentive for innovation in technologies that reduce emissions into commons like airsheds or the global atmosphere, the way it does for more traditional business innovations. And so the federal government is in a position to adopt policies that would recreate the same incentive structure the patent system provides in those environmental spaces where the lack of property rights and resources means that you can't capture the gains from innovation. So that's something else the federal government should definitely be doing. A third thing the federal government should certainly be doing is identifying barriers that exist to the deployment of a lot of new technologies. J.B. Rule at Vanderbilt, and I forget who he co-authored this paper with, but has written a really good paper about what happens when the Green New Deal meets the Green Old Deal. And the idea is that we have all of these well-intentioned regulatory structures that we created in the 1970s designed to constrain development. And those regulatory structures and permitting processes are going to and are in fact delaying the development and deployment of low carbon technologies, carbon-free technologies. We've been worried about whether we can build wind turbines in Lake Erie for years and years because of going through the permitting process. The Biden administration just approved an offshore wind development in Massachusetts, but the first offshore wind development in Massachusetts was supposed to have been up and running over 12 years ago. And it wasn't because it went through years and years and years of permitting and regulatory induced delays due to a regulatory system that is very unfriendly to new technologies, very unfriendly to new developments, and particularly when a lot of those new technologies and new developments aren't coming from the established players, right? Exxon, if it wants to do something offshore, it can get through that permitting process just fine. A new tech startup that's trying to get through those processes doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the ability to deal with the delays and tying up of capital. So the federal government really can and should be doing things to remove those sorts of barriers to technological deployment. And I think we're starting to see some progress there. Where I think state and local governments should focus their efforts insofar as they're concerned about climate is really more on the adaptation side. That is to say, recognizing that some amount of climate change is inevitable. Even if we did everything I wanted or everything that Bill wanted tomorrow, there is a significant amount of greenhouse forcing that is already in the system and will be contributing to climate change in the coming years, whether we continue to add to that or not. And then, of course, there are emissions around the world that we have to worry about as well. And dealing with adaptation is often a question of things relating to local infrastructure, local land use, and so on. And a lot of those decisions are really best dealt with at the state and local level. And sometimes it involves infrastructure, sometimes that involves building codes, sometimes that involves things like updating and revising laws relating to things like water rights. I mean, there are lots of, we could go on dozens and dozens and dozens of areas in which thinking about adaptation is important. But as a general matter, state and local governments are really on the front lines of that and are in the best position to be focused on those questions.
So, I really feel terrible for the Federalist Society members who arrived hoping that we would just clash the whole time and it would be like, watching a great boxing match. So again, even though I don't usually wear Team Federalist sweatshirts, Jonathan and I agree a lot here. I'm going to frame it a little differently. So I'm going to first, kind of as he did, go back a little bit to a segue of the first discussion we had. And so, he said he's comfortable with tax as the only way to deal with carbon, or as the main tool to deal with carbon. And importantly, it's carbon dioxide is emitted usually through combustion, and it is emitted with other pollutants in connection with other activities that have multiple risks. And so, at a practical level, when you, the people in attendance, are advising clients and working in businesses, you will find that it's going to be other things there will be carbon dioxide emitted or other greenhouse gases as part of other activities. And so part of the reason people are concerned with this issue called hotspots, this concentration often of pollution effects, is because it's the activity. In other words, there aren't people who sit there just smoking a carbon dioxide cigarette and emitting it. There's going to be particulate matter. There's going to be sulfur dioxide. There's going to be particulate, there's going to be other harms and sometimes hazardous air pollutants that are also greenhouse gases. And so I just think it's important to realize that that's part of the problem. It's pollutants don't come out as one thing. They come out as part of complex operations. Second, just and this ties into federalism, this issue of, what tool do you use? Jonathan's brought it to another level. And again, putting on just my law professor hat for all of you thinking about law school, perhaps, among the tools that people think about with a problem is which form of law, not just which tool, like a tax versus, say, a technological mandate. And so some tasks are handed to what are called administrative agencies. These are subparts of the government and the executive branch that tend to build up expertise, like the Environmental Protection Agency. And other things are done by legislation, where Congress passes a law that's either set something directly or more often hands a task to agencies and may make some of the big fundamental choices. And so, so here we do have one disagreement, and that Jonathan thinks that a tax imposed by legislation would be more stable and entrenched than might be other regulatory tools. And the reason I don't agree with that, and it could be the case, but the reason I don't think that that's the whole story is that you all should always think about anything in politics, not just as about what egomaniacs who are politicians say, or maybe technocrats within an agency say, and who may be all well-intentioned and wonderful people, but you have to think about it also as an interest group game, where different associations will either buy into something and become committed to its retention, or they will be happy to escape regulation. So if you followed when, let's assume that you are mostly in the 18 to 25-year-old range since you're undergraduates, when you were just hitting your teen years, the auto industry said, we support Obama automobile regulation and restriction of pollution. We're all for it. And then Trump came in and he said, we're going to take the restrictions off you. And the auto industry said, we are totally for taking the restrictions off. Well, actually, they didn't all say that, but a bunch of them said that. And then President Biden was elected and a group of them said, we support regulation. So you can have some groups will just go back and forth. And that tends not to be good as for the society or for businesses. And so you just have to think about interest groups and whether they essentially really get deeply invested. And taxes are one way to encourage it, but other forms of regulation that may be issued by agencies sometimes can actually lead sectors to invest deeply in, say, technology or some way of running a business, and they then will lobby against losing their investment. And so you just have to think about businesses and getting them to get committed. And so taxes can be part of the picture. I just don't think it's the whole picture. Federal, state, and local. The question was, should this be federal, state, or local? And if you listen carefully to Jonathan's answer, his answer is much like mine. The answer is yes, it should be federal, state, and local. Okay. And so what you do need to think about is which levels of government will be best able to design effectively strategies to reduce climate change, that is climate change causes, mitigation that's called, or address adaptation, address responses to the harms of climate change. And I think virtually everyone would agree that the largest unit of government possible is generally best situated to come up with a national policy that will create a level playing field and will encourage people to improve. It's just you have less problem what's called leakage. There's otherwise this risk that one polluter will run to another place and escape regulation. And so that generally is not a good thing, especially with climate, which is a worldwide problem. So you do want the largest unit to be the main regulatory actor, especially for mitigation, and that would be the federal government, where you have a real government with real powers. We will hope for international agreements that reduce distrust, but each nation will have to act to make the law real. So then the question is, what about state and local? Okay, and so part of the answer is state and local have to have retained power. So if the federal government screws up and doesn't get it right, or loses will, or is sued, or is tied up in the courts, whatever, they get it wrong, you need to leave the power for the states in the United States to do more and fill in the gaps or act. California, I think, is economically the 6th largest nation in the world. I think by the last data I saw, if California has ways to really do much better for climate change, we should applaud that fact, as long as they're kind of still otherwise participating in our nation's project. And then similarly, state and local also historically have primacy. That is the main regulatory role when it comes to land use, zoning, kind of the quality of life that we see around us. And you really want to always allow state and local governments to do that. And that is a huge part of climate. That one of the biggest sources of emission is how buildings are built, what our transportation infrastructure does, how we regulate agriculture. These are all huge contributors or huge choices, and their state and local governments play major roles. So the way to think about this is not one or the other, but you want concurrence. And I would add on top of that, Federal Society's roots were in its early days, probably, I would say, first anti-regulatory, but second, I would say belief that the Constitution set some basic principles. And it also is deeply rooted in our country's Constitution that states should retain, they have their own independent roles that should be respected. So when it comes to a close call, law should preserve room for the states to do more and to play their part, either cooperatively, and that's often in what's called a delegated program where they work with the federal government, or where they may decide to do more. And the last thing I'll say, and this is just an interesting story. So years ago, I was part of a discussion about in 2009, 2010, there was a climate legislation proposal on the table. And I was part of a a roundtable discussion under what are called Chatham House rules. So I can't say who said what. I can say what happened roughly without identifying. But there were some issues about how climate legislation would work. And someone was making an argument for a particular design, and some other people in the room were from the states. And at that point, the states were well ahead of the federal government in different elements of climate regulation, and also coming up with cleaner energy, investing in sometimes more advanced transportation modes that were lower greenhouse gas emitting. But in this conversation, a champion of a federal answer described how this person thought things should work. And a top official from a state said, no, you have it wrong. That won't work. If you do it that way, that doesn't work. We tried that and it had the following dysfunctions. And so we realized that particular design would not work. And so we shifted to a different strategy. And it shifted the discussion. And that's a classic experiment that the state had been working in the absence of federal regulation, had been trying different things. Some things worked, some things didn't. But that's one of the miracles of our federal system, is that there is this latitude for policy experimentation, and you can figure out what works and what doesn't work. And so for that's another reason you want to retain states, is they can be effective policy, implementers, but also, frankly, smaller scales. If they screw up, the cost is less. If they get it right, it becomes the model everyone can emulate. So that's what I'll say there. I'll stop at that.
So I think we can probably combine some of the next questions, moving on a little bit to the EPA. So how necessary or effective would you say the EPA is in the modern day? And then also, while you're commenting on that, if you could explain the decision in the Massachusetts v. EPA case, and explain why it's called one of the most important cases in environmental law. I'm sure we'd be happy to hear about that.
So Jonathan, do you want me to go first on this one, just a change of pace?
Either is fine. Sure.
So first, as the question was asked, so the first question is, how is the Environmental Protection Agency? The Environmental Protection Agency is a large administrative agency. It carries out many of our nation's environmental laws pursuant to what Congress has enacted. So it is a big agency with a huge regulatory turf. Okay, it's not just clean air, clean air, clean water, hazardous waste. It has a vast array of roles it fulfills. EPA at its best has been a generally law-centered agency that has also a very substantial technical and scientific staff that tend to do a pretty darn good job in figuring out what's going on in the world and figuring out what the risks are and what can be done. And so, and I say this, we're not going to talk tonight about all the agencies in the government, but there are some agencies and departments, both in this country and others, that are basically, treading water. They don't do much, or they tend to be ineffective, or they may be too captive to one sector or another. So EPA, I think, is generally viewed as a pretty professional, pretty competent, pretty law-centered agency. That said, it's done well at times, it's done poorly at times. All agencies need to be nudged to do well. And that all of you who are listening should just realize agencies are heavily influenced and legally must respond to effective comments and input from the public and interest groups. And so what an agency does or doesn't do, it's not like they stand by themselves. It's an interactive process. Congress gives them good laws or doesn't, and then people interact with the agencies. And so, actually, I would suggest that, Jonathan, that maybe we break apart EPA and then shift to Massachusetts. Sure. So before talking to Massachusetts, I just say there that you understand the agencies are not freestanding, that they are interactive. But Jonathan, why don't you give your 2 bits about EPA as an agency, and then let's talk separately about Massachusetts.
Yeah, and Bill and I will disagree more about this than I think a lot of the other things we've talked about. So my view about EPA, I mean, yes, I agree at one level, it's done some things well and some things not so well. But I do think it is an agency that has some fundamental flaws, and I think largely they're because when the EPA was created and when through most of its history, the sort of discussion Bill and I have been having about how to think about what levels of government should be taking the lead or might have a comparative advantage at addressing what sorts of problems in what sorts of ways, rarely informed what the legislation that EPA was then required to implement. So the EPA spends the vast bulk of its time and effort on problems that the federal government does not have a particular comparative advantage in the 21st century at addressing and approaching, and relatively little of its time on those sorts of problems where the federal government has a dramatic comparative advantage, and indeed where the states are both individually and collectively incompetent to deal with those problems. And this has been getting better over the last, say, 15 years, slowly. But the reality is that the EPA could really use a reorganization where we really focus on, okay, we are only going to devote so much energy. So we're only going to devote so many resources. The EPA is only going to be so large. It's only going to have a certain number of people. Given those constraints, what are the things that the federal government, qua federal government, should be focusing on? Climate would be part of that. So would meaningful cross-boundary problems like the regional contributions to ozone formation throughout the Northeast, which implicates a great many states. But it would not implicate a lot of the things the EPA spends a lot of its time on, including under statutes like the Clean Air Act, where if you went page by page in the Clean Air Act, the bulk of the Clean Air Act is not distinctly focused upon either cross-boundary problems or products sold in interstate markets. It's focused on very localized problems. And in some cases, the hotspots that Bill brought up earlier. And whatever we think might have been the case 50 years ago or 60 years ago, and I have a book coming out that goes through some of that history and explains how a lot of that history is actually different than what we think it was. In the 21st century, states have environmental agencies. They are going to be involved in environmental problems. They're not all going to have the same priorities. They're not going to make it the same, or going to have the same policies, but they're all involved. And they should be the ones taking the lead and devoting the resources to those environmental problems which are most local and most regional in nature. And the EPA, because it will never have the resources to do everything, it never has in the course of my career and Bill's career, and it won't, should instead be enabled and indeed required to focus its efforts on those areas where the EPA is in the best position and the federal government is in the best position to play a contributing role. And I suspect Bill disagrees with that, but I think that that's something that is long overdue. That's the argument that this book that I'm finishing up makes. And that would require a fairly dramatic reorientation of a lot of what the EPA does. It means it would spend a lot less time on hazardous waste sites. It would spend a lot less time on drinking water systems. It would spend a lot less time on air and water pollution that is truly localized, which much, not all, certainly not all, but much of it is. And it would spend more time on the ozone transport problem. It would spend more time on the actual transboundary aspects of interstate water pollution that the agency through most of its history has ignored. But that, again, that's a dramatic reorientation away from the EPA as it has existed for the past 50 years.
Okay. So your other question was about, so Jonathan and we do disagree there some. I think partly, I think the rationale for having a federal regulator with substantial power is more expansive, whatever. There are additional rationales we can't get into fully today that actually, Jonathan, we've written articles that dozens of people have read once. These are bestsellers in the world of legal scholarship. But you think, but there's actually a slight distinction there that I took Justin's question as more, how is EPA as an institution? And Jonathan's question took it a slightly different level, which is, has EPA been handed the laws that allow them to handle tasks in a way that is logical. And I think what Jonathan is pointing out correctly is there are certain kinds of problems that legislation could more effectively empower EPA to act. And so that's a slight, so just for, again, for knowing you're not all law students yet, what Congress chooses to hand in the way of power to EPA is one question, like you can handle certain tasks and here's how, and the other is how EPA does with that. I was focusing on how EPA does its work. And I think John was focused a little more about how EPA has been empowered or enabled by Congress. But in any event, I look forward to your piece, Jonathan. I suspect I know what you'll say in some of it because I've read some of the articles, but it's an interesting issue that, when you think about an environmental ill, and this ties into Massachusetts and carbon, is, you need to think not just about the locus of say where pollution is, but what causes it. What are the dynamics leading to the problem? Who can effectively handle it? Where do the interest groups stand? You have to think about all regulation as a much more complex, as this is to you, the students, as at a complicated level of thinking about all the players who will try to influence it. A phrase from a famous administrative law professor is regulation is always polycentric, that many-centered, that there are always lots of areas of power, and you really can't figure out the right legal answer until you think about the many-centered nature of many regulatory challenges. So Massachusetts versus EPA, Justin asked about it. Massachusetts versus EPA is at its most basic, and I'll step back. This is a famous Supreme Court case where Massachusetts sued EPA, trying to get EPA to address at a more specific level the greenhouse gas emitting risks of motor vehicles. And EPA had earlier denied that it had the power to do so. The case went to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to break down what makes it interesting and important. But Massachusetts and then others aligned with Massachusetts ended up litigating up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that under the Clean Air Act, EPA's power to regulate air pollutants, and especially air pollutants that cause endangerment from these kinds of pollution sources like motor vehicles, that EPA did indeed have a broad grant of power and could do so if they found upon examination of the science and the facts on the ground that there was this kind of endangerment caused by the pollution from this category. And so it was an extraordinarily important case because it was the case where under the existing Clean Air Act, the Supreme Court said EPA already had power to start addressing climate change. Again, it didn't make the final step. It said that EPA could, if they found the science supported it, would have the power under the statutory power handed to EPA. This was also important because there's similar language about endangerment that applies to other categories of polluters. So once, and similarly, the same language about air pollutant generally applies across numerous, I'll just call them programs of the Clean Air Act. And so once the Supreme Court said air pollutant is broad, EPA has the power to act if it finds this kind of endangerment. It basically forced EPA to go and look at the science and the data and the categories of sources and start taking actions to address climate change. And so, it in some sense was the case that started EPA down the road of regulating greenhouse gas emissions from a whole array of categories of polluters. It's not a perfect statute to do so, as Jonathan would say. There are, we've been talking a lot about today about other tools that might even more effectively and rapidly address climate change. But as with most things in politics, you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And with the reality of climate change, this was a hugely, hugely important case. There were other interesting twists to it that you should just be aware of. So, how is it that Massachusetts could force people to do this? Well, again, our system of federalism and the design of these statutes allow states to try to get the federal government to comply with the law. That's one of our national experiments. Years ago, I was teaching a a program abroad and explained how our enforcement regime works in the United States. And a student from a Soviet bloc country says, "Are you saying in your country a person or a state can sue the president of the United States to get them to act?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "It is not that way in my country." So it is that way in the United States. And so that itself is an interesting experiment. Massachusetts could want more action and try to get the United States to comply. There were other issues I don't think we'll get into tonight, but there was a big issue about what's called standing, whether Massachusetts and others, had an adequate claim to be heard in court. And the court found that they did have standing, that Massachusetts had standing, leading some people to describe the case as kind of a trifecta, that for the court to come out as it did, it had to kind of resolve several questions in ways that were all kind of up for grabs. But because the case came out as it has, it launched the vehicle of the United States addressing climate. And I should say that since then, this is not just one case now. I'm not sure how you count it, 4 or 5 cases, but there are now a handful of cases where mostly Massachusetts has been retained, has been locked in. It's been limited in one case, but it also was the foundation in another case to limit the power in some respects of other efforts to use common law to address climate change. But so it's really not one case. If you want a stable system of law, which is something that kind of across the spectrum is generally viewed as good, this actually at this point is longstanding statute, the 1990 Clean Air Act. It's been found this way since Massachusetts. You've had a handful of Supreme Court cases that have stuck with that as an important foundational precedent. And so I think it was sound on the law, sound in its other issues, but also an extraordinarily important case. And what really was great about it is it did in the end force EPA to grapple with what the science and the data showed about climate. And the last thing I'll say, and then Jonathan, I don't know if you agree or disagree, but so in the wake of Massachusetts, EPA had to do this endangerment finding. That is climate real? What does the science show? And they did a very massive study of the risks of climate change, and they issued the endangerment finding. And there've been a few since that largely piggybacked on that. And one of the interesting things is, this goes back a long time, Massachusetts, every administration since has not really found grounds to reject that, including the Trump administration, which tried to roll back virtually everything that had been done to address climate. They didn't try to go against the endangerment finding, that science and data is strong. And I think people knew they wouldn't be able to defend an attempt to reverse that regulatory finding. So take it away, Jonathan.
So Massachusetts versus EPA is certainly hugely important. It is the wellspring of almost all federal regulatory efforts that currently exist or that are currently authorized to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. There are a few exceptions, but it is the wellspring of the vast majority of it. I happen to think it was wrong as a matter of law, and Bill and I don't have the full opportunity to get into that. And I think the standing holding is problematic, and I think the statutory holding is problematic. And if either of those had gone the other way, the third holding, which I think was correct, the court would never have reached. But it is the law, and it certainly, it being the law and the fact that the EPA has the authority under Massachusetts versus EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, combined with the fact that other than for vehicle emissions, which was the first step in implementing Massachusetts versus EPA or applying it, was to regulate emissions from motor vehicles. Other than for motor vehicles, the Clean Air Act is a god-awful statute to try and use to deal with climate change. So as a political reality, as someone who cares about climate change and who would like to see the federal government pivot to what would be both a more effective way of dealing with climate change, but also one that is less of a threat to liberty than trying to use the Clean Air Act to control climate change. The fact of Massachusetts versus EPA being on the books, and the fact that the Supreme Court is not going to undo it, because the Supreme Court as a general matter does not overturn precedents that concern interpretations of statutes. And the oversimplified reason for why that is that if the court got the statute wrong, Congress can fix a statute. So the court doesn't need to fix that mistake. That contrasts with constitutional rulings, where if the court makes a constitutional error, the only way to fix that, short of the court fixing it, is a constitutional amendment. And that's really, really hard. So stare decisis is much weaker in the constitutional context, in the statutory context. And in fact, in one of the oral arguments in one of the follow-on cases to Massachusetts versus EPA, it sounded at one point as if the industry lawyer wanted the court to overturn Mass. And Chief Justice Roberts interjects and says, well, you're not asking us to overturn Massachusetts because we don't do that. A very clear signal that, maybe they got, and Chief Justice Roberts dissented in Massachusetts versus EPA, right? So even though he thought it was wrong, his view is, look, we don't disturb statutory rulings. So given the fact that it's a very imperfect way of dealing with climate change, it does have some interesting effects on the politics of climate change in that there's some room to maneuver. There are interest groups that would prefer something other than the prospect of EPA regulation. I think there are environmental reasons to prefer something other than Clean Air Act regulation. And that does, I think, create some opportunities to put together a broader coalition for a deal to do something better, like a carbon tax on climate change and on the Clean Air Act. We'll see if that happens. But we are seeing positive signs. We've seen quite a few companies within the oil and gas industry just in the past few weeks endorse the carbon tax. Mitt Romney has said positive things about a carbon tax. Lisa Murkowski said positive things about a carbon tax. You could do a carbon tax through reconciliation. You could not overturn Massachusetts versus EPA in return for a carbon tax, or you wouldn't really overturn Massachusetts versus EPA. You'd leave its application to motor vehicle emissions in place, but perhaps carve out stationary sources, factories, power plants, and the like. But the fact that there are an increasing number of Republicans willing to talk about something like a carbon tax or doing something proactive does create some opportunities. And the fact of, so even though I think Massachusetts versus EPA was a bad decision on the merit, just on the legal merits, as a policy matter, I do think its presence alters the political landscape in ways which might be conducive ultimately to significantly better climate policy.
Can I add just one thing, a quick thing? I know we're running out of time, that I just think Jonathan said that really is worth saying, just as an important aspect that people don't often get about law, that law, kind of like markets, tends to be kind of incremental problem solving. That is, that people don't always know the complex way laws will work. And so, what he said, a case like Massachusetts can be, probably most people would agree, it's an imperfect statute to address climate change, but it advances the cause of trying to figure out how to address a genuine social problem. And so if you look at a lot of social ills, sometimes the dynamic is people just try to advance the ball that will encourage people to take the next necessary step to address a problem. And so in that respect, it is just important to realize law is a problem-solving human institution that tends to go step by step. As the Supreme Court has said in some major cases, that Congress passes laws and agencies whittle away at problems incrementally. That's how the law works, but it also means politics keeps moving things along. So that's all. But in any event, thank you for that. Justin, what do you want us to do now?
All right, we have, I believe it's 4 questions from the audience and about 10 minutes left. So maybe I'm going to try to get through all these questions as quickly as possible. So Dalton Nunemaker asks, what is the strongest public messaging approach to present climate change action to the American people?
If I knew that, I wouldn't be a law professor. It's a challenge, especially in the current polarized environment.
Yeah, I guess I would add also that having been part of a lot of these sessions, I think it is important for people to understand that the world doesn't come to an end when you address climate change. That is, there are lots of things that can be done. Also, people need to understand that if you don't address climate change, there are major disastrous risks that are starting to happen at risk. And so it really needs to be something where people see both that the remedial measures and adaptation measures can be good in many instances, are not that difficult, but also that inaction comes with substantial risks. And so but the problem is people have really studied this messaging. As far as messaging, a lot of people have pointed out that you can't just be doom and gloom. That tends not to work very well. And so there is this aspect of making sure people see that things are possible and not disastrously disruptive. And that is, by the way, there are states that have been very aggressive on climate change, and things are fine in those states. And so every time those examples, that perhaps assists.
All right, our next question is from Jody. It's a kind of a two-part question. I counted it as two questions. So we'll start with, if the US implements constraints on carbon emissions, how does the US prevent industries from moving to China and India? And what potential economic and environmental impact would that have? And then maybe if you want to toss this in, what's the impact of overpopulation, if there is overpopulation, on all of this? And how would the tax code address that?
Wow, two very separate. So on the first, the empirical literature we have suggests that environmental regulation is less of an influence on international siting or international location decisions for businesses than other things that affect the relative costs of siting in one part of the world than another. So it's not zero, but it's less than people think. And if you look at energy prices, it's not clear energy prices, given the sorts of changes with the carbon tax we're talking about, that the effects would be enough to have a significant effect of that sort, although it's always possible. What's generally talked about is that with a carbon tax, it's relatively easy to do a border adjustment. So basically, you impose the tax on goods that are imported based on what sorts of climate policies do or do not exist in the country from which they're coming. And most of the trade folks whose work I put faith in have argued that you can do that in a way that's WTO or GATT compliant. And that's the way you would handle it. And that's conceptually, it's somewhat similar to the way that things like a VAT are handled when it comes to international trade. That is to say, there are ways of dealing with differential tax incentives or differential tax systems at the border that minimize some of the potential for leakage from results of them. On the overpopulation question, there are places where resources and institutions are not capable of providing the existing populations in those places with what they need, but that has no correlation with total number of people, population density, population growth over time, or any of the other neutral or objective metrics we would provide for population. Rather, it tends to have to do with what the underlying institutional framework is. That is to say, most of the places in the world we think of as being overpopulated are far less dense than Manhattan. The problem isn't their density. The problem is the other institutional factors in those areas, and that's where we should focus. And in terms of global population, it's pretty clear that global population is going to top out this century and start declining. And in much of the world, it already is. And that's a function of wealth, education, and other things. And that's the trajectory we're on. So it's not a problem. I think as a global matter, it's not a problem. I think we need to focus much on.
Yeah. Actually, most of what Jonathan said, I think, is sound. And so I'll just second it. So right, the numerous studies have looked at variables that are empirical studies trying to figure out when and why businesses move. And notice, by the way, what it even means for a business to move. It can be the flow of dollars, it can be the flow of particular companies, of goods. But the bottom line is variables other than environmental regulation are far more significant. And so that's one area where, like, our reinvestment in higher education, engineering education, and infrastructure are extraordinarily important. Businesses always identify those as very important to their locational decisions. And so, the United States, if it wants to compete with other places in the world, we have to think about how we create a first-class environment for people as employees and workers and businesses. And so some of that is just investment in our human infrastructure and physical infrastructure. It's just rare. There are very few instances of businesses moving where environmental regulation is the issue. Labor cost is big. And so, but that's a very different issue. And so that's something else to think about. And there are other ways to address it and create appropriate incentives. Overpopulation, yeah, I was going to say exactly what Jonathan said, that when you look at that, human institutions are far more important than is just raw numbers of people. And then also environmentally, some of the most densely populated areas in the world are some of the most environmentally good, that when you look at per capita emissions and the rest. And so it's a much more complicated, that population does not track environmental disaster. You know, it can, but there are other variables that are bigger.
All right, and then moving on to the last audience question from Zega Razwork. Is the political power of the oil and gas industry a threat to climate change policy, or is this not important?
It's less important than most people think, for a couple of reasons. One, the larger players in that industry care more about a certain and predictable regulatory environment than they do about the specifics of that climate. Exxon has been on board with the carbon tax for years now. They believe that in a carbon tax environment, their competitive position remains what it is, if not improves. And so they're fine with that. Some of the smaller players in the industry, some of the less vertically integrated players in the oil and gas industry certainly care a lot more and are more aggressive. Certain parts of the coal industry have been. That's certainly true. But as an empirical matter, it's not clear they've really been the drivers. One of my colleagues did, as part of an empirical project several years ago, looked at lobbying expenditures during the debate over the last time there was serious climate legislation in Congress, the so-called Waxman-Markey bill in the House. And he found that there was no evidence that lobbying expenditures against the legislation were greater than lobbying expenditures for and simply about the legislation. What he found is that there was a lot of activity by business investing in tweaking the details of the draft legislation so that if it passes, particular concerns were taken care of or not taken care of. But that dollar for dollar, it's hard to look at what the lobbying expenditures that were being made and say the oil and gas industry and other opponents outspent the proponents. That the evidence for that is not there. Further, I think if you look at where that opposition is the greatest in Congress, it's a more ideological and grassroots-driven phenomenon. Republicans who were voted out of office for, among other things, endorsing action on climate change, people like Bob Inglis, who had a 90-some ACU rating before he was voted out, will tell you it wasn't the oil and gas industry. It was the primary electorate in his state was very conservative, very populist, and very against this action. And the members of Congress that are most adamantly opposed to this sort of legislation are responding to their constituents. And that's true of the Democrats that waver on climate policy as well. So I think too much time is spent imagining this evil Coke-influenced oil and gas behemoth that somehow has a stranglehold on climate policy, and too little time and attention is spent on what is it that makes climate policy so scary to so many people, either in terms of their livelihood or in terms of their conception of what government should be doing. And I say that as someone who think there are legitimate reasons to be worried. I mean, carbon dioxide is the most ubiquitous byproduct of industrial civilization that we know of. Saying to the government, you get to regulate it wherever it appears, gives the government the authority to do a lot of things. And just as we don't want to give the government a blank check in national security, to come back to some of what we started on this evening, I don't think you want to give a blank check to the government on environmental policy either. It so happens, though, I believe, that there are policies that do allow us to address climate change in ways that are more conducive to liberty and that don't require, this great green regulatory behemoth. And this is, I guess, kind of, since I know we're getting ready to close, closing thought I would give to the students is, a challenge that I would say my fellow folks on the right have not met is thinking really seriously about how do we deal with problems in ways that are more consistent, or can we come up with solutions that are more consistent with our underlying values and views of the proper role of government, rather than simply dismissing problems simply because progressives come up with solutions that we don't like. Well, if you're a conservative, most progressive solutions to most problems are going to be things you don't like. But that doesn't mean the problems aren't real. And it doesn't mean that conservatives shouldn't take governing seriously and shouldn't think seriously about ways of solving those problems that are consistent with conservative principles, that are consistent with the Constitution. And I hope our discussion tonight, at least in part, suggested that there's a lot of room for that. And it's certainly room that I hope more folks on the right will try and fill.
On that, I actually think the oil and gas industry's role here is complicated. So one is actually gas has not always been, that is natural gas, that side of it surprisingly should have been lobbying in a big way for climate legislation back in 2009 and 10, and for some reason sort of sat it out. So they were sort of a puzzle for people who looked at interest group politics. People weren't sure about it. Historically, the oil and gas industry has funded misinformation and affirmatively dissembled at time based on at least some of the documents that have come out, what they knew in the way of risks. And so they have been a big part of the problem, the public perception, skeptics about climate change. A lot of the skeptics' views were funded by or influenced by oil and gas. And so part of it is there is a residual effect of that longstanding opposition to regulation. Right now, I think what Jonathan said is correct, that a lot of America's biggest, most successful industries, including some in the oil and gas sector, realize that they will do well. They tend to do well. They have very professional operations. They will find ways to make money if they know what the rules are. Oil and gas products are not just used to burn, they're used for other things. So I do believe that today they may not be as opposed. I think but here's the one place where I think Jonathan and I have a very fundamental disagreement, that politics turns on very small numbers of people who are persuadable, okay? And so if oil and gas either does not clean up its act from misimpressions left by earlier statements and lobbying and funding of research and the rest, that is, they're not out in front now saying as vocally as perhaps as they could. And some are saying this now, climate change is real and the human contribution is real. They would need to kind of actually affirmatively embrace and encourage politicians who generally oppose regulation to support regulation. And the problem here is it's just, politics turns on the last swing vote, whoever can get it across the line. And so if oil and gas just still has that mild persuasive power, it may not be the loudest voice, but in a partisan gridlock setting where things turn on a few votes, it will probably take something more in nature of affirmative support for regulation and real clarity, including with campaign contributions, that they want to see regulation. I think that in that sense, that would be what is necessary.
All right. Well, Professor Adler, Professor Busby, thank you again for this great evening and event. I'm not sure, Lucy, is Michael being buzzed back in to close us out, or should I go ahead and close us out?
I think you can just close us out.
Okay. So again, thank you all for coming to this week's event, and keep an eye out on our Facebook and Instagram and other social media pages for upcoming events. And in the meantime, please enjoy the rest of your evening and week. Thank you again for coming, and good night.
Thank you very much. And good luck to all of you students. Stay healthy, be careful.
Yes, definitely. Thank you all.
Okay. And Jonathan, stay well. Nice to see you.
Likewise.
Yep. Take care.